Long ago, taking care of those that no one else could take care of were the poor farms. The old, the sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, the orphaned, the alcoholic. For those unable to live independently in our society, the Eastmanville Poor Farm in Ottawa County was like many such poor farms across the country. A place to heal, or to work, or to live with dignity.
The Poor Farm was there for indigent people who really needed it. It was there for them. It gave them a reason to be. It gave them a purpose.
I think its time had come and it really made a difference in the lives of so many people.
I am so thankful that in those days there were institutions that did take care of the poor.
It made a great impact in their life in a great and wonderful way.
They had been thriving institutions at one point. They really did serve a very public need. They had come to the rescue of a lot of people.
Everyone felt like they belonged and they were needed, and that we felt was very, very important for all of us.
In a time long before the establishment of our modern social safety net, this place existed because there was a need. And as the oldest continually operating poor farm in the country, it went on to serve its community for over 130 years. And the Eastmanville Poor Farm still serves the community today as an Ottawa County park, recently celebrating its 150th birthday with a grand sesquicentennial event, featuring exhibits, live music, and historical reenactors. Known also during its day as the Infirmary, and later on as the Community Haven, the farm was also a social institution, a place where those who might otherwise have lived isolated and destitute lives were instead given opportunities for meaningful work and inclusion into a community that could improve their quality of life. This is the story of some of the people who, by fortune or by fate, found themselves here, at this place. And some of these stories are truly extraordinary, lives of adventure and of tragedy, lives of poetry and of service, lives that were touched and forever changed by the Eastmanville Poor Farm in Ottawa County, Michigan. The story of the Poor Farm begins with a plot of land just west of the village of Eastmanville, Michigan, settled in the 1830s by farmer Daniel Reilly and his brother-in-law, Captain Henry Miller. Reilly and Miller operated a farm and built a home on the site.
It was built as a house for Reilly and his family to live in. He built this as a residence, and he built it as an inn. And he called it the Midway Inn because it was halfway between Grand Rapids and Grand Haven on the Grand River. And the Grand River was the major route of transportation prior to the railroad. And this served as a beautiful place for people to stop, to get off, to have a meal, and in some cases to spend the night.
As the Midway Inn provided lodging for weary travelers, a divided nation marched towards a deadly war between the states. The American Civil War erupted in 1861, and as it raged on for 4 bloody years, hundreds of thousands of Americans on both sides were killed, wounded, or displaced by the war's end.
At the end of the Civil War, when the Army stands down, these soldiers go back to the very communities that they came from. The country was transitioning from a vast wartime footing to a peacetime setting. In addition to the soldiers returning home, There was the fact that the United States had fought the world's first modern war. And so you had modern consequences, which meant lots of refugees, lots of casualties, lots of people who have been mutilated and were suffering from all kinds of difficulties. And so what to do with all these people, how to take care of these soldiers, how to take care of the wounded, the Poor Farms were one answer to that challenge.
And so, in 1866, not long after the end of the war, Ottawa County officials purchased the Really Farm and established a poor farm at the Midway Inn, much like other counties across the Midwest, from Pennsylvania to Texas.
A farm was often purchased from someone who had settled there and then converted into a poor farm. The idea was that it would be a working poor farm, and people would then work off through their labor the benevolence that was given to them by the local counties.
Wounded local veterans returned to their communities and were taken in by the Poor Farms. And it wasn't too long before the Poor Farm at Eastmanville began taking in other county residents as well. Residents like shoemaker Peter Plug, an elderly Dutch immigrant who, like so many of his countrymen, settled in West Michigan in the mid-1800s.
Peter Plug was my great-great-grandfather. He was born in 1798 in a small town in the southern part of the Netherlands called Etten. He had 17 children. His older brother Benjamin had trouble with the church, and his older brother was ready to move to this country. His older brother seemed to know Reverend Ralty at the Pillar Church in Holland, Michigan. They must have corresponded, and Benjamin must have said, hey, it looks good, let's go to America.
Peter left his life in the Netherlands behind, going with his brother to Reverend Albertus Van Ralty's colony in Holland, Michigan. But Peter, now age 57, was an alcoholic who likely was not welcome in any church community at that time.
I don't think that my great-great-grandfather Peter belonged to a church in Holland, Michigan, and especially not if he had a drinking problem. Because in those days, they had no understanding of what it meant to be an alcoholic.
Tragedy soon struck Peter and Benjamin. The great fires of 1871 that swept through the upper Midwest burned the city of Holland to the ground. The brothers' shoemaking shop was destroyed, their lives ruined.
And so Benjamin, the older brother, was out of work, out of a job, and in all likelihood, also because of age, retired, because 2 or 3 years later he dies. And so Peter Plug was out of a job.
Stays at the Poor Farm followed, and in 1876, Peter Plug was admitted for the third and final time.
According to the Poor Farm records, he became bedridden 3 months before he died. He read his Bible studiously. He repented of his former life, and according to these records, he died having been reconciled with God. End of Peter Plug's life at the age of 79, lonely at the Poor Farm, confined to his bed, an old man.
The Poor Farm's services were available to all residents of Ottawa County. Soldier or civilian, all races and ethnicities were welcome.
Ben Jones was a former slave who escaped from the South and settled in the Grand Haven area prior to the Civil War. When the Civil War started, he joined the 102nd Infantry, which was an all-colored unit, and eventually went south and fought during the Civil War. Now, for Ben Jones and any other African American to join the Union Army, they had significant reason to worry about returning to the South. They had to worry about being accused of inciting a slave rebellion. Certainly one of the punishments for that was death. There was also the very real possibility of being re-enslaved.
Knowing all too well the risks of his enlistment, Ben Jones didn't hesitate to volunteer for the 102nd Michigan Infantry, campaigning throughout the South.
After the Civil War, Ben Jones returned to the Grand Haven area and made a pretty good life for himself. He was well known by people. People knew him as a town character. Those African American and white veterans who came home to their communities, they were greeted as heroes, as well they should have been.
Ben spent time away in a soldier's home in Wisconsin, but returned to Grand Haven in his old age and was admitted to the Poor Farm to live out his final days.
It was a place where people could feel that they weren't abandoned by the community. They had some place to go. They could stay there with some degree of dignity and live out their final years. And Ben Jones, being somebody who not only fought in the Civil War but was very liked by his community, would find his way to the Poor Farm and be allowed to live out his final days in some semblance of decency.
In recognition of his service, Ben Jones was buried in Grand Haven, Michigan, with full military honors. The Poor Farm at Eastmanville was also a final refuge for a different kind of hero, a man born on a boat in the Grand Haven Harbor, and whose daring exploits on the waters of the Great Lakes made him a local legend.
Billy Andrus was born afloat, and it would turn out that his life would be one in which he would be strongly connected to the water throughout his entire life and his entire career as well. He had the opportunity at age 14 to become the assistant at the Grand Haven Lighthouse.
Billy was later given the opportunity to become a founding member of the Grand Haven Station of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which we now call the U.S. Coast Guard. He established a reputation for bravery, saving passengers and cargo from ships in distress on Lake Michigan. He parlayed this reputation into a career as a local lawman.
Billy was quite a physical specimen. Grand Haven was not a calm town in the late 1800s. It was a pretty bawdy place, and so it was his responsibility as city marshal to keep the peace. And I'm sure it helped to have an intimidating stature.
Public wrestling matches were a popular pastime in the 1890s, and the strapping Billy Andrus was known to take on all comers.
A nationally known wrestler was traveling through. So when this Tom Cannon came around, they suggested, hey, Billy, you should take this on. Tom Cannon pinned him in the first round, and then Billy pinned him in the second round. And then in the third round, Billy Andrus was able to pin the champion. And so he defeated this touring national champion of wrestling, and so he became a pretty instant local hero because of that success.
From there, Billy's legend only continued to grow. He went on to captain the North Manitou Island Life-Saving Station in Lake Michigan, then on to the Jackson Park Life-Saving Station in Chicago, before leaving the Great Lakes area altogether. Heading out east during Prohibition, perhaps tracking down rum runners with his beloved Coast Guard. Late in his life, Billy found his way back to his old hometown, even got his old job back. But he was old, and soon his health began to fail him. With no immediate family to take him in, his sister stepped in and made arrangements for him to go to the Poor Farm in 1935. Sadly, the many accolades that Billy had earned throughout his life could not save him from his fate.
He was out at the Poor Farm for only about 13 months, but it's believed that because she financed his stay out there, that he really was not contributing to the Poor Farm, but really that was a place for him to reside where he could get the kind of care that he needed in his last days.
At the time of Billy's death, the nation was undergoing a dramatic change. The passage of the Social Security Act of 1935 created income support for the elderly and the infirmed. Gradually, over the coming decades, fewer elderly residents were admitted to the Poor Farm.
The county found itself less involved than in caring for just people through a normal aging process that needed to have residential care. And that then transitioned the Poor Farm into more of a housing situation for people with disabilities.
Under the guidance of keepers Tom and Doris Moderman, the Poor Farm, now called the Ottawa County Community Haven, continued to take in residents with a diverse range of needs. One such resident was a man with amnesia thought to be over 100 years old, and in 1965, he became national news.
Joe Steele was the oldest living resident at the Ottawa County Poor Farm when a reporter came from Holland to interview him and to find out about his life. When the reporter got there, Joe Steele had been a resident for 58 years.
Found wandering the countryside in a daze near the community of Steele's Landing in February of 1907, this man with no name, half-clothed and suffering from hypothermia, was taken to the Poor Farm.
He couldn't remember much, and he could not remember his name. The staff at the Poor Farm gave him the name Joe and the last name Steele. When the reporter filed his story, he included a picture with it. A fellow by the name of Monroe Eaton saw that article, and it triggered a memory. And somehow there was something about this story that Monroe Eaton said, "This sounds like the man that my mother used to talk about."
Monroe Eaton visited Joe and eventually discovered that Joe Steele was actually his long-lost uncle. Joe's real name was Monroe Ruddy.
The story doesn't end there, because Joe Steele, or Monroe Ruddy, continued to live at the Poor Farm, and when he had his 110th birthday, he received congratulatory notes from Governor of Michigan, William Milliken, and President Richard Nixon of the United States. NBC newscaster David Brinkley even announced his 110th birthday, so he got nationwide acclaim for his age. Sadly, he died the next year, but he was 111 years old when he died in 1971.
Monroe Ruddy, also known as Joe Steele, was buried next to his mother not far from the town of Saugatuck, Michigan. His passing, or so it seemed, marked the end of one era at the farm and the beginning of another. The 1970s were a time of change at the farm. A new and modern community haven building was constructed on the property, and a new family, carrying on the tradition of the keepers of the past, came to live at the farm and direct its day-to-day operations.
It was a gift that my husband and I had the opportunity to come to Community Haven and serve there. To be able to be a family at Community Haven and working, it was the best. We loved to involve our children, as well as my husband and I both being able to serve at the same place. We loved being able to work together, play together with those that we served, and it truly enriched all of our lives.
By this time, most of the 60 or so residents at the farm were developmentally disabled. Many of them were elderly. Most all of them had no one else to take care of them, and they truly found community at the Community Haven.
My parents were extremely creative, and they just seemed to make it happen. I would have never considered it to be a poor farm, or even a farm. A farm you think of as a dirty place or a smelly place. I didn't see that to be at all. We'd have movie nights. Each of the staff would put together silly things as well. And so just to say, oh, you went to a group home, or oh, you're at that farm or something, like, oh no, that was like the richest place in our community.
A good friend who knew that I trained horses for a living and saw that the community haven had the horses but really didn't know what to do with them, how to program them. So he spoke to Glenn and Sarah, and then Glenn and Sarah called me, and it was just like the perfect fit. I always said that Glenn and Sarah, they wanted residents to have the opportunity to have life skills, not just house them. And I loved that about that place.
When you live and you work in the same place, it changes your perspective on the work that you do and how you do it. It affects everything. Realizing that residents do not go home, this is their home. It's my home as well.
The family atmosphere really was clear. And one young resident, she wanted my husband and I to adopt her. And so she wrote up adoption papers, and so we adopted her. And she would always then write notes to me as mom.
The residents and staff at the community haven truly shared a powerful bond, a bond formed through shared living and shared work. But difficult times lay ahead. Michigan and other states were responding to a nationwide trend away from government-run care facilities like the community haven. Funding for the farm, which was always tough to come by even in the best of times, became ever more scarce.
When my husband and I came to the farm, we were told right away that we only had a year before the farm would be shut down because it was in very much disrepair, and a lot of needs were there, and county was concerned about the expenses of it. My husband and I had to really fight to have a strong presence in the community.
The institutions were closing up. It was difficult. And whenever I spoke, and whenever we were interviewed, it seemed so positive, but it wasn't enough. I think Glenn and Sarah, more and more, they were getting tired. I was getting tired.
The Collisons left the community haven in 1987 to pursue other opportunities to serve those in need. And Ottawa County officials struggled for years to decide what would become of the old Poor Farm. Renovation of the aging infirmary building was deemed too costly, and rehabilitating the structure to meet modern standards of care would be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. The decision was made to demolish the old infirmary and the community haven building, and its residents were encouraged to move into group homes and nursing homes in the surrounding area. The old barn and a few outbuildings were all that was left. After a run of over 130 years, the Poor Farm's time was up by the year 2000. But a dedicated group of community volunteers would soon take on the challenge of preserving the stories of the Eastmanville Poor Farm and protecting the site for future generations. Moving into the 21st century, community efforts to preserve the Poor Farm were underway. Ottawa County Parks and Recreation took over in 2004, protecting the old Poor Farm as the new Eastmanville County Farm Park. And a poorly marked and long-forgotten graveyard on the property was rehabilitated in an effort to honor those buried there almost 100 years ago.
With underground radar, they proved there were a lot of graves there unmarked, and it's now proven to be a very nice little cemetery with a definite identification of almost all the bodies.
The Eastmanville Farm Cemetery was dedicated in 2010. Altogether, 64 bodies were discovered on the site, and the names of those buried there are enshrined on a commemorative plaque, their memories preserved for history. The Eastmanville Farm Cemetery is a place of remembrance, a quiet place to reflect on those who lived in the Poor Farm community, many of whom for the last days of their lives. And that spirit of remembrance lives on at the old Poor Farm. In 2016, the park hosted a Poor Farm sesquicentennial event open to the public. In addition to the live music, historical reenactors, and other events, several exhibits and displays could be found in the old barn, including a striking piece of artwork tucked away in the corner.
My concept was to pay honor to the many people that were associated with the farm. And those people were the residents and the caretakers and supporters of the farm. Names are extremely important. They're very personal, live forever. I want it to be a reverence. I want it to be somber. And I wanted people to go up next to the panels, next to the names, put their fingers, touch them, and have a real sense of connection with those people.
The Poor Farm stands as a chapter of American history, a piece of American history that really needs to be publicized more. People need to understand that we've always had people in our society that have been invisible, people who have sometimes fallen into hardship, people that sometimes simply need a community to care for those who either are lesser equipped or have fewer resources to care for themselves. It speaks to the issue of how Americans truly can respond to each other when we're at our best.
It really, for me personally, reminded me how important it is in our country and our society to take care of each other and see to it that there are ways that we can have a quality of life and be sustained in our old age, regardless of our life experience or our careers or what contributions we've perhaps made to society.
My great-great-grandfather, he lived there for for the last 3 years of his life. Wonderful that at least he had people he could talk to, that he would not die somewhere in an alley as a drunk, but that he was cared for. So I'm thankful for the Poor Farm.
It is good to be a servant sometimes, you know. I don't know that our present society understands how to be a servant and the joy that you receive from that.
It's important as a society that we're not moving so fast that we forget the people that are next to us, that we just slow down to see what we can be a part of versus it's all about us.